Hi, Jared.
Hey,
How
how's
are
it
you?
going?
Doing well, doing well. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, of course.
All right. So I would like to I'd like to spend maybe, about an hour or so talking to you about, the challenges of being a locum tenens urologist. And hopefully, you can share your insights into what you've been doing in the past 3 years as a locum tenens urologist, and maybe help other doctors to kind of succeed in the future, especially, I guess, somebody who's just new to locums. But if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and, kind of giving us a little bit of intro of maybe how you started doing locums, in the first place.
Sure, yeah. So, I grew up in Illinois, did med school at Rush on the west side of Chicago, and then moved down to Tampa, Florida at USF for urologic surgery training. And then, essentially, initially after that in 2017, I took a hospital job, employed job with a hospital. I was the only urologist that they had employed, and essentially we were setting up a practice. Unfortunately, throughout that experience, I really came to understand the difficulties within the system, and especially being an employee within the system and not having kind of final say or control over a
Right,
lot of things.
right.
And so, to a large degree, quite honestly, I almost had one foot out the door as I was leaving there. I got my real estate license in Florida, and was looking at other options other than medicine just because of burnout. And quite frankly, obviously what the government is basically kind of shutting a lot of independent physician practices
Right.
based on reimbursement decreases and the cost of practice and all that stuff, and over regulation and whatnot. So to some extent, I was looking for something else, and I knew to a large degree I never really wanted to be somebody's employee again, because putting myself in a position where I can't deliver patients the care that I want to deliver them at the quality that I want to deliver them, and I have no say over it, basically,
Right.
because I'm just an employee, isn't a situation that I wanted to be in again. So, thankfully I found locums. I still love urology, and I love helping people through surgery services and what have you, and was able to. I think one of the solutions that I thought was or found was very helpful for me was claiming back some of my time,
Right.
and locum certainly helps that big time. To a large degree, I've been able to make basically either the same or actually even a bit more than I was making as a full-time doc in about half the time. And so from that standpoint, that opens up a whole world of opportunities for you to either, start another business or do whatever else you want with your time. And so that's what kind of really appealed to locums for me. Number one,
Great.
I didn't want to give up urology. And number two, I just didn't see a feasible way to start an independent practice by myself at the time in
Gotcha.
2020, which, obviously, especially with COVID and everything else,
Right.
like the whole thing is a mess, right? So,
It probably
uh,
was the worst year to really start anything new, right?
right,
At,
right,
at least in
and even
healthcare. At least in healthcare.
and
Yeah.
even just in general, right? Trying to negotiate with insurance companies as an independent guy, as a single practitioner, it's very difficult. A lot of them just kind of laugh in your face and bat you around like you're a cat and mouse type situation. And so
Right.
from that standpoint, locums was a nice blessing to be able to continue to work and serve. And quite honestly, I think one of the biggest things I really love about it is that, you know, a lot of the places that you potentially would be working probably won't have any other urologists if you're not there. And so to a large degree, the patients are super grateful for you actually being there and being able to help them, because otherwise they wouldn't get any care at all. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I've noticed that is different from, kind of day-to-day full-time work in a situation. I didn't really find that gratitude from patients in a day-to-day, at least the employed situation I was in anyway.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Cool. Cool. So, you've been doing locums for the past 3 years, is this correct?
Yeah, in November it'll be 3 years. I started basically in October of 2020 and what have you. So
Gotcha. Gotcha.
about 2.5 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the themes that I hear a lot, when physicians tell me, hey, I like locums because I make the same money in half of the time or almost half of the time. and I can spend the rest of my time, doing real estate or, working on my business project, my startup. So I think it really fits a lot of, especially younger doctors, I think, who have, like a lot of different, other projects maybe they want to work on. So I think that's really great. Um, can I ask you now, because I know you've got, quite a bit of experience looking for locums jobs, and it sounds like you tried different ways to find locums jobs, but what could you tell me maybe what you think is the best way to find locums jobs, at least in your book?
Hmm. I'll be honest, I've done some research to try to do direct locums and essentially trying to tackle that on my own. But quite honestly, I found, working with a designated company that's already kind of built some relationships and what have you, has been more, I guess, more fruitful and also easier,
Right.
right? I mean, to some extent, the laborious process of trying to figure out exactly which hospital is actually in the need based on the kind of general descriptions that a lot of times are listed out there, and also trying to figure out who actually to contact, because obviously you don't want to be contacting the representative from the locums company. You want to be contacting the hospital side directly, right? And that's not always
Right.
super easy. And I didn't find that was a huge best use of my time, I guess I should say. And so that, from that standpoint, I've worked with a couple of different companies now and been able to, kind of maximize my time and kind of minimize the need to kind of necessarily, kind of branch out into that myself.
Gotcha. So essentially you mentioned a couple of companies, and of course you don't have to mention the names or anything like that, but do you feel like it's a good idea to try multiple companies, or maybe get in touch with a lot of companies, and then decide which one you want to kind of work with long term, or how would you kind of approach it? Because that's another common question I get. Hey, how many agencies you think I need to work with? And I do have my answer to that, but of course, I'd like to hear your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this game, right, you're working in temporary work where most of the contracts are 30-day potential cutoff, right? And so from that standpoint, I
Yeah.
think that, having variety, having, a couple of different companies that you could potentially be working with, or at least are, have good working relationships with, that they send you jobs and listings and such, would be of your best interest. Because otherwise, I mean, obviously, if for some reason, I mean, quite honestly, just like when you're an employee as an independent contractor, these hospitals are not going to come to you and say, hey, listen, in 2-3 months, this job is going away. Usually
Right.
that'll be a much shorter, oh, hey, 30 days, this job is going away. And you're kind of left scrambling, which obviously, as we all know, taking 3 to 6 months or so to credential and potentially get a state license, if you need to get a new license, obviously puts a big monkey wrench in that. So that's where I think, working with a couple of different companies, or potentially even working at a couple of different sites within the same company, would kind of give you a little bit of protection from that type of scenario.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. So, now again, another common question I get is, how would you assess the demand for urology as a specialty in a locum tenens job market? Or another question that's kind of related, have you ever had troubles finding locum tenens work, since you started 3 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, trouble is kind of a generic term. I mean, I think to some extent you're going to have to kind of sift through a couple of different options. It's a numbers game, right? So you're going to have to
Right.
find the situation and opportunity that's good for you. But I think that, I mean, quite honestly, I still get emails and messages or text messages or what have you pretty much every week, if not more than every week. And so remember, urologists are already a critical shortage throughout the country. And on top of that, about 35% of us are over the age of 65. And so that's only going to continue to decrease the
Yeah,
numbers
worse. Yeah.
years. And so from that standpoint, I mean, quite honestly, that's one of the biggest things that I always, think in the back of my head when I'm talking to hospitals or negotiating specifically is, listen, they can't do the work without me. I can work without them somewhere else. And the reality is there's already a huge shortage And
Right,
so to a large degree, I think that the opportunity that's out there is only going to get more and more
right,
numerous.
right. I think what I've noticed is that yes, there's a demand for, and it's different for different specialties, right? So for urology, the demand is probably one of the highest, at least based on my assessment as well. But Um, I see one thread when the doctor may have like very specific requirements for the job, right? Oh, I only want to do outpatient. Or maybe there's certain procedures, again, I'm generalizing right now, maybe there's certain procedures that I don't want to do, right? Or maybe I only want to work within that, close to that city because like my kids maybe go to college and that's it. It's something like that, right? So I think from my experience, you probably still need to have a good degree of flexibility in
Right.
order to be able to secure jobs, right? I think that's an important point as well. I'm not sure if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the more flexible you are, the more willing you are to go to different areas and or get new state licenses or what have you. I mean, actually, I even know a couple of docs kind of in the same scenario that you mentioned. One only wanted to go to places that he could drive to. The other one
Right,
was not vaccinated, and so from that
right,
standpoint, that significantly limits your
right,
opportunities, right? So really, you kind of want to be that jack of all trades that can potentially do a lot of different things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're uncomfortable doing something that the hospital is going to make you
right,
do it. You can tell them, listen, this is
right,
off limits, but these are all the things that I will do.
right.
And so from that standpoint, I mean, to a large degree, you want to keep yourself flexible in your options to maximize the potential opportunities that are out there.
Great, great. Yeah, perfect. Um, so let me ask you this. So if you were to say, if you were to think about all the different gigs you've done or the different jobs and hospitals you worked in, right? Um, can you think of a typical maybe run of the mill, so to speak, urology locums job that is out there in the market? Like, is there a certain pattern that you see in those jobs? Like maybe it's typically inpatient or outpatient, or maybe typically in terms of the, what type of a hospital or type of a facility. Do you see any of those patterns in general in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big variety with the need for the hospital. I mean, some of them are strictly outpatient, some of them are inpatient, some of them are a mix. Certainly, kind of better understanding that as you're considering each assignment is very important. I don't know that there's necessarily a specific kind
Okay.
of typical prototype,
Right.
because I think everything, the need for each place is so much different, right? So,
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
I've worked in situations where I was doing clinic and taking call essentially kind of at the same time. I've worked in situations where I was just doing outpatient clinic. I've
Right.
worked in situations where I was just doing, kind of inpatient call and covering all of that, and kind of a condensed half day clinic where we saw kind of they had kind of an acute care model for urology in that hospital. And so there's kind of a large variety that's out there, and to some extent, again, you can kind of find exactly what you want, but to some extent, if the more flexible you are, the easier it's going to be for you to find job and keep cash flowing for yourself and your family.
Gotcha. Gotcha. In terms of the you know facilities, in terms of where they're located, have you noticed that more you see more jobs coming from rural facilities versus suburban versus metro area? Can you assess that, or again, you've seen everything pretty much in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly some kind of bigger cities, I would say, or I guess smaller cities that have opportunities. I've certainly worked in like Fort Wayne, Indiana. They had an opportunity there, and that's like 150,000 or so people, right? And
Right.
also worked in Peoria, Peoria, Illinois, which is kind of similar in size. So I think it varies a little bit, but I think certainly more rural hospitals are struggling, and so from that standpoint, I think a lot of the jobs do tend to be a little bit more rural in nature.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Perfect. So, let's see. So I guess I'd like to cover some of the some of the more specific questions to the urology, and some of the questions you suggested actually when we changed emails yesterday. So yeah, the question that I really liked, I think would be really interesting to hear about is, do you find the equipment usable and in good condition working order at the hospital? I think it's more of a surgical specifics that I don't know about. So if you
Right.
can cover that, that would be nice.
Yeah, I think this is something that I would certainly recommend that anybody asks about when they're considering an
Okay.
assignment. Is kind of what, and for me, I think the biggest thing, I mean, that I always make sure I ask about is their ureteroscopes. I mean, I think there's such a difference in the market of the quality of them. And certainly stone disease is one of the most common things that you're probably
Right.
going to deal with on these types of assignments. And so from that standpoint, if you really, especially things you're going to be doing over and over again, you really want to make it as easy as possible for yourself, right? So from that standpoint,
Correct.
that's probably one of the biggest things. I mean, obviously, I know there's folks out there that do some robotic surgery via kind of locums type positions and whatnot, and certainly you're going to want to inquire about the specifics you would need for each case, or kind of the team that's going to be with you working and their experience and what have you. But otherwise, I think for the most part, like cystoscopes, I mean, even if they're older, a lot of them are still pretty functional. I think you do have to be a bit flexible in that again, and essentially kind of to some extent work with what they have. But at the same rate, that's another thing you can kind of inquire about up front is,
Right.
hey, listen, if I get in there and the equipment that you have is not necessarily what's going to be the best thing for me to be able to help patients to my maximum ability, is there any flexibility or consideration for kind of replacing that and what have you? And I quite honestly, I found most of the hospitals are pretty darn flexible about that type of thing, because
Good.
obviously they realize that you have to be able to,
Right.
you have
Right.
to have the tools to do your job, right? So
To take care of your patients. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now, do you find in general, again, based on your experience, do you find that the supporting staff usually helpful, and sufficient? I mean, when you go to a new hospital, you're new kid on the block, so to speak, there's always internal culture, internal politics. So what do you think about that?
yeah, I mean, I think in general, yes, absolutely. I mean, most of the places have, pretty good support staff in place. I have had situations where, actually, quite honestly, like even just a quick example, there was a nurse practitioner that was going to exercise class rather than coming to clinic.
Okay.
And so, I kind of went up to the administration and kind of started asking some questions first
Right.
before kind of calling anything out and whatnot. And it kind of came to light, and they realized what was going on and what have you. So, I mean, there's certainly, bad apples out there for everything. And I'm not
Right.
trying to, say nurse practitioners are bad or anything like that, but, so it can vary, of course, but at the same rate, I think in general, most of the places recognize that you need a team around you to be able to serve the best you can. And so from that standpoint, most of the places have a pretty decent support staff. The only caveat to that I would say is that, again, a lot of these places are kind of distressed and to some
Right.
extent may not have the best culture in the world. And so to some extent, there also can be some significant amount of turnover with that type of situation, right? So from
Right.
that point, it's not always a stable situation either. So that's something to kind of think about as you're kind of, preparing for an assignment.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Oh, so what about the administrators? Generally speaking, have you found them supportive and helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Generally speaking, again, yes. I think there certainly was one situation where I got out of pretty quickly because I realized that they didn't really care about me or trying to help patients or what have you. And, even when I brought some concerns to them about how things were going, even though I was the only person there, I was there and there was nobody else. They had no other full-time urologists. They just didn't, the culture there was just really not great. And that was one of those places that there was a lot of turnover in the staff too. And that's where I was like, all right, I'm going to give you my notice and I'm going to find a different situation, which is nice. I mean, it's an easy flexibility, right? I mean, I think it's,
Right.
especially when you're already kind of traveling and kind of branching out from your local area, the ease of and fluidity of transitioning is a bit different, especially if you're kind of preparing for that, than if you have kind of a full-time job and are, you know, kind of going through the whole process to look for another full-time job and that type of thing. So that's one of the bonuses of being an independent contractor, is that you get to make that decision, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, if you, whether it's based on your availability or whether it's based on
Right.
what's going on in the situation or whatever, you know, you get to say, yes, I'm going to continue to work here, or no, this is really not a situation that I want to be involved in. And, you know, you can find a better situation for yourself.
Right. Right. Now, since you mentioned you know, staff turnover, you know, and the fact that, of course, you know, you may not be working in the same site for more just, you know, 1 week or 2 weeks at a time, you know, how does it work in terms of when you leave that assignment, whether you leave and you're going to come back in 2 weeks or a month, or maybe you will never come back? Do you always have someone coming after you to kind of cover patients, you know, after you're gone? Does this transition normally work, I guess?
Yeah, great question. I think typically I would say yes. And you know, to some extent, I think most places usually kind of want more of a kind of a scheduled continuous commitment, like 1 week a month or 2 weeks a
Right.
month, whatever, rather than, you know, hey, I can do a weekend here or I can do a week here this month, and then who knows when I'll be back. But
Right.
you know, so from that standpoint, there is some kind of regularity of it. But I mean, I certainly have been in situations where, you know, I essentially left and there was nobody else there because the hospital didn't
Wow.
have anybody to cover, which was
Right.
a bit concerning for the patients. And obviously it's certainly a big strain on the system, right? Because
Right.
at that point, any urology consult that they need, they basically have to ship out.
Right.
Uh, you know, but I mean, certainly, again, some of these places are distressed, and the grand scheme of things is you can only do the best you can, right? I mean,
Right.
actually, at one assignment, I actually ended up working 5 out of 6 weeks straight on call for the
Wow.
hospital because they had nobody else, and they were like, "Listen, can you fill this void?" And I was like, yeah, we can arrange that for the right negotiation, you know,
Right. Right.
situation here, because obviously that's more hazard for me, right? If I'm
Yes.
on call for basically 5 out of 6 weeks straight, that's a big amount of stress plus exposure for malpractice and what have you.
Absolutely.
But so yeah, I would say by and large, I mean, again, most of the time you're going to have, like, for instance, one of the other situations I was in, basically it was me and another doc that were alternating every other week. And so from that standpoint, there was always somebody else there. And again, to some extent, there are certainly facilities that also have other urologists that are already practicing full time there. They just need extra help because they don't have
Right.
other full time employees. And
Right.
so in that scenario, obviously the full time docs, you know, kind of would essentially kind of be able to cover and take care of stuff if you're not there.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, working 5 weeks in a row on call, that must be tough, huh?
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, I'm sure. All right. So let's talk about the schedule a little bit. Just to for me to understand, like for example, in being a hospitalist, our schedule is, you know, usually 7 on, 7 off, plus some extra shifts kind of when you have a week off, you can pick, a few shifts here and there. Typically, that's the typical schedule I see, even for locums actually. So have you noticed that again, there's any certain pattern to the schedule that hospitals prefer to see, or at least something that maybe you've noticed, kind of to be more frequent, most of the time? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think they're looking for, you know, kind of consistency, right? To a large degree. I mean, whether you
Okay.
can commit to a week a month or 10 days a month or 14 days a month or what have you. And essentially kind of the scheduling of that will kind of play out in the longer term of the conversation. But you usually, again, rather than these one-off situations, although there are some of those out there, most of the time they're looking for kind of a consistent commitment for days that you can work within a month to kind of help them fill their schedule. So
I see.
that would be the most common. I haven't really experienced much else, to be honest, myself.
Have you ever had a situation where you want to do, like, for example, you would prefer to do 2 weeks in a month and then, take 2 weeks off and then come back in 2 weeks, but the hospital say, no, 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 we only want, let's say, 3 weeks at a time? Or have you ever had a situation when they were like not giving you a lot of flexibility in terms of choosing your schedule with locums?
Um, I guess to some extent, I wouldn't say necessarily
Okay.
100%. I mean, I think quite honestly, they're somewhat flexible too. And I guess that's the
Okay.
beauty of it, is that there's more jobs out there than
Okay.
there are urologists, right? So if they're going to be that hard nosed about something that you don't want to do, it's easy to say, all right,
Right.
well, I'm sorry, then I guess you're not getting
Right.
anything from me.
Right.
And that's the leverage that you have that's completely
Right.
different than you as an employee, right? So you as an employee, you're there on their schedule. You as an independent contractor, you're there on your schedule when you're
Right.
available for them, right? So that's a huge leverage aspect that is
Gotcha.
different, which allows you to kind of have a little bit more control of the situation. But yeah, I mean, I haven't really crossed anybody that's or crossed any hospitals that have been, super
Difficult about it.
difficult about you
Right.
have to do this amount. I mean, I've worked anywhere from, a week to 10 days a month to actually up to 3 to 4 weeks a month sometimes for a shorter duration of time. But so that they are pretty flexible. And a lot of times what will happen is you'll kind of get, credentialed with them and get set up for the assignment. And then to some extent, you'll be able to kind of pick and choose the dates that are available. And if there's more available and you want to take more dates, you can. And if there's not, and you want to take just what
Right.
you agreed on, then you can kind of do that too. So yeah, again, I haven't seen anybody that's been super hard
Okay.
nosed about that situation.
Gotcha. So it sounds like employers are usually pretty flexible with scheduling when they're trying to engage with you in the
Yeah, in
first
my
instance.
experience. I mean,
Yeah.
again, obviously
Yeah.
they want to be able to fill the need that they have,
Right.
and to some extent you have to work with them on that part.
Right.
But in the grand scheme of things, it can be very flexible, and or you can just say, well, this job's probably not for me if that's the way you're going to go, and if you can't work with me and make it work for both of us, then you won't get my services anyway.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. Perfect. Uh, Now, how far out do you typically get your schedule?
I think that varies a significant amount. Right now I'm basically getting it about 1 or 2 months in advance. Prior to that, I was actually getting scheduled out about with a different company. I was actually getting scheduled out about 6 months in advance, where they would kind of lay out all the dates over a 6 month period or what have you, and kind of because obviously again, right, the hospitals want continuity, they want smoothness, they don't want big gaps in their schedule, they want the consistency to be able to make sure that the hospital is covered. And so from that standpoint, for a lot of them, scheduling out further in time makes a lot of sense for them too.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, let's now get to uh, arguably the most exciting question, which is the pay rates and the compensation. This is a thoroughly kept secret, I think, in the industry. Like this is information, like it's truly hard to find information about pay rates for pretty much any specialties, and agencies tend to really hide this information because I think they really want to have more and more leeway to give you a lowball offer. I think they're really all against the transparency typically. So I'm hoping to hear your thoughts about of course, I understand there's a range to the pay rate. It depends on a lot of different things, and probably I assume depends on location, the workload, type of cases, whether it's outpatient, patient. But can you tell me a little bit, I guess, about can you give me an overview, I guess, about on the pay rate in general for urology locums?
Yeah, I'd say when I started out, I was basically making about 2,700 a day for a day of clinic, and I think about 3,300 or so for a day of call.
Right.
And so to some extent, that was kind of what I knew. Thankfully over time I've evolved and understood and better understood my own value. And
Right.
to a large degree now, especially when I'm talking about folks or talking about like 24-hour call shifts with hospitals, the way that I value my time is based on an hourly basis. And so if I'm giving them 24 hours, whether or not I'm at the hospital or, kind of at the hotel on call, there's significant limitations on what I can do to essentially create other wealth during that time that I'm on call for them, right? So
Right.
from that standpoint, I value my time at about $250 an hour, which I think is
Right.
probably most surgeons should be at least at that. And that
Right.
results to about $6,000 a day, of course. But,
Right.
I think that as I've evolved and learned better how to negotiate, and also to some extent, part of your negotiation also, I mentioned earlier, is a little bit of like a numbers game, right? And so from that standpoint, you may expect to get more no's if you have higher rates that you're asking for, but at the same rate, I think the opportunities are still out there for a lot of folks. Quite honestly, I have it on pretty good authority that the average urology locums hospital or the average hospital that's paying out for urology locums is paying out about $7,500 a day for call coverage.
Right.
Unfortunately, like you kind of mentioned, a lot of the agencies that are out there are not so transparent, and a lot of them are taking 30 to 50% off the top of what the hospital is paying out, right? So that's where I think, as certainly, kind of in my discussions with you and what have you, your agencies is quite different than that, and very transparent about what you're making versus what the hospital is giving and what have you. Which some aren't, and especially a lot of the corporate ones. And quite honestly, remember, a lot of these agencies are actually owned by private equity, right? So a lot of them have significantly deceptive business practices in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I would encourage folks to kind of shoot higher, and maybe if you expect that you're going to land up a little bit lower than what you shoot for, but at the same rate, if you're above what they were otherwise offering, that's still a win-win, I think, to a large degree. So, I mean, certainly right now, I'm basically making about $5,500 a day. That includes essentially kind of clinic or outpatient surgery and 24-hour call all in one bundled. So, I mean, there is a little bit more, I guess, more work that's involved there, but it also, essentially, obviously, allows me to gather, a bit more of a higher rate too. So from that standpoint, I certainly, especially, the fact that I haven't done direct locums or what have you with the hospital, and I've always worked with agencies, like, I don't mind the agency making money, but I don't want them making more money than I'm making in a day based off of my work, and to a large degree. I mean, certainly, especially now, if they're not going to be transparent with me about what they're making compared to other things, to what I'm making and what they're getting paid, that's kind of a non-starter for me, to be quite honest.
Yeah, perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you. I know you mentioned some of your negotiation strategies, clearly aiming, reasonably high, but do you have any other advice how to negotiate a higher pay rate? And, this could vary from kind of the script that you tell to the agency, like the certain things you say or certain things you maybe point their attention to. For example, what I like to do when I negotiate with agencies, I used to really like to analyze the job, is getting as many details as possible, trying to find some of the things that could be, I call them pain point about the job, like something that is not really attractable for other hospitalists, and kind of go from there versus just say, hey, I want to get $250 an hour just because I want that, and that's fine. I mean, there's definitely certain market rates, but I don't know if you can tell me about any of the other tips, negotiation tips.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, obviously a lot of docs are not so great at negotiating, and I think one of the biggest things I could recommend was the book Never Split the Difference. I think it's by Boss, right?
I heard of. I've heard
this. It's a great book. He does talk about anchoring. You want to anchor high, and even if you fall below that, you still hopefully are getting better than what you were otherwise going to get. And other than that, I mean, quite honestly, again, remember that they need you more than you need them, and there's an opportunity out there for a significant amount of other jobs. And so, to some extent, remember that it's a numbers game. Remember that determine what your worth is to yourself, what your time is worth for you, and how much you're going to have to sacrifice. Like you mentioned, analyze the job and understand what the pain points are. If you're taking call for one hospital, that's one thing, but if you're taking call for 3 hospitals that are over, a 10 or 15 mile radius, then to some extent, that's going to be a significantly different, situation, right? And so, from that standpoint, understanding that, and again, understanding that you're worth more to them than they are to you, and quite honestly, they can't really produce anything without you. And so unless they put another body in there in your
Hmm.
place. And so from that
Yeah.
standpoint, um, don't be scared to go high. And if it ends up that it's a no, again, it's a numbers game. The more no's you get, the
Right.
closer you get into what your actual value is. But what I would encourage you not to do is to accept less than what you think you're worth, at least to a significantly large degree. I mean, certainly if you
Right.
need to keep cash flowing and you need to take a job that's paying a little bit less for a while just to protect yourself, great, do it. But in the
Right.
long run, I mean, I would really, focus on, trying to have what your value is and communicate that. And essentially, if they don't see your value and they're not willing to work with you on that, then that's probably not a job you really want to be taking anyway.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice. Yeah. I think I remember you mentioned once, I think when we talked in the past, you said that when the facility doesn't have a urologist working, right? Let's say that they lost the service, right? They lost the doctor. You even mentioned the number, how much money I think they're losing in revenue, or maybe you mentioned how much one procedure potentially generates for the hospital, right? So I think if you look at the number, it was a crazy amount, right? I remember. I think. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. I don't remember the exact figures anymore,
Yeah,
to be honest. But yeah,
but
I
tens
mean,
of thousands of
again,
dollars essentially,
again,
right? Right.
it's not only the fact that they're um, essentially paying you for your value, but they're also paying you to make sure that they're not having to, like I mentioned, that one situation where I left and there was nobody there for a week after I left. And from that standpoint, again, they have to transfer everything out. And so think about
Yeah.
all the lost revenue, not only the lost revenue, but the essentially difficulty for the patients and also for just the ER or anybody else
Yeah.
not have anybody to call. And especially remember when you're talking about, any type of trauma center, they absolutely have to
Right.
have a single
Right.
subspecialty
Yes.
or they're at risk of losing their accreditation.
Right.
And so from
Right.
that standpoint, again, it's an opportunity cost piece, right? So if you're not there and they can't serve people, then they're going to lose a heck of a lot more money than they otherwise, could potentially be spending to pay you for your wages.
Right. Not even talking about hospital reputation, right?
Right.
Because patients are unhappy. So of course it has the snowball effect as well down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I think we've got a few more questions I wanted to cover. So uh I think let's talk about some of the negative things about locums and um, you know, of course, like anything else in the world, it's not always, sunshine. There's always certain negativity to it. And I know for a fact a lot of doctors don't even want to do locums because some of those negative things. But have you had any, I'm sure you've had frustrations with working locums, but what are those frustrations typically, and how do you normally deal with them?
That's a great question. I mean, I think to a large degree, you have to again understand you're going into a distressed situation, and to some extent, you can't expect it to be the most well-oiled machine and expect everything to just kind of go like you would want it to go. So having that expectation and setting your expectations for that up front, I think, is a great way to try to avoid some of the stressors. But yeah, I mean, certainly there was situations where I was taking 24-hour call for a hospital, and I had nurses from the floor calling me for routine consults in the middle of the night. And I brought that to the administrators, and they were like, "So what's your point?" And I was like, "All right, well, I'll know. I know where I didn't say this out loud, of course, but thinking in the back of my head, I'm like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to start looking for a different situation
Right.
because." I
Right.
mean, it really doesn't make sense for you to be getting woken up, especially if you're going to be working as hard as you're going to be working anyway, as we all do as physicians throughout the country, to essentially be disturbed in the middle of the night for routine stuff that could otherwise be easily, waited for until the morning. So I mean, there's certainly any number of different things that could be problematic. I mean, obviously, travel delays sometimes can be a problem. Certainly, I think being, in that situation, I think communicating with whatever agency you're working with and
Right.
also with the site, certainly is very important. A lot of times they're obviously very flexible and can certainly, kind of understand those problems. Beyond that, again, to some extent, equipment issues can be somewhat of a bit of a frustration. I think, again, kind of asking up front and kind of starting that conversation very early and saying, hey, listen, if things really aren't working out with the equipment and I'm not able to do my job the way I need to, is there room for us to kind of maybe do some improvement? And quite honestly, even the ureteroscopes, that's a pretty significant investment for a lot of hospitals. But at the same rate, there's a lot of newer equipment or newer technology where they have disposable ureteroscopes that are just as good or better than the reusable ones, and can be much less of an investment for the hospital. And so from that standpoint, there's always, some solution that could potentially be found. I think keeping that conversation going is super important. Other than that, quite honestly, I haven't had a ton of issues. I mean, I certainly there's frustrations. I think the biggest thing, again, is to keep your head about it and understand that you're there as a visitor and you're there, at a defined time. And to some extent, even as an independent contractor, and probably less so, potentially than an employee, you may have less pull, but a lot of these places will do whatever they need to do to keep people coming and to help out, right? And so from that standpoint, if the opportunity is help you do your job better or not have you at all, to a large degree, they have to weigh that in the balance and make those decisions themselves. So I think that's again, remembering your leverage points is a great way to kind of get, more things done if you need to, or get changes made if they need to be made, if they're really problematic.
Gotcha. Great advice. Yeah. Have you noticed that asking certain specific questions before you start the assignment, maybe when you just start engaging with an agency, helps you to avoid some of those troubles, some of those frustrations, actually once you start the assignment?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, again, having that conversation early and certainly asking the site, I mean, certainly a lot of the communication, I think, sometimes is gone through is through the agency, right? So to some extent, but making sure you're still asking the questions and you're still, kind of getting a sense. I mean, to some extent, you can kind of also get a feel for, how well they're going to respond to you asking questions or bringing up problems or what have you, by the way that they respond to you, in those early conversations to a large degree, right? So, I mean, if they basically just kind of completely shut you down and say, we're not going to answer this question, or
or they just ignore you for like weeks and weeks,
what have you. Yeah, that's a huge red flag at that point.
Flag, yeah.
But I don't think that most sites are like that. I mean, I think, again, most of them understand that there's potential needs that they may need to invest in, or changes that they need to make to essentially kind of keep people coming to help them out, because otherwise, again, they're going to end up with nothing, and that's, for a lot of places, that's a big problem.
Yeah. Great advice. Yeah, perfect. And I think my last question would be, you've been doing locums for the past 3 years. You've got quite a bit of experience doing that. You've been to multiple states, multiple different settings, right? So, can you think about what would you do differently if you start working locums again? Let's say you're a total newbie, you're starting day one. Maybe you just quit your full-time job or transitioning from full-time job to locums. What would you do? What would you do differently? Or I guess the related question is, what are the mistakes that you made that maybe you would not have made if you knew what you know right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest thing that I would do differently is just try to negotiate harder up front in the beginning, because at the beginning I was kind of just accepting what they were offering to some extent, because I didn't know much better, right? And then, as I kind of went along, I learned, to learn more about the value and kind of what the industry was paying to a large degree, and what have you. And so, kind of leverage that. But I mean, I think otherwise, quite honestly, I mean, it's like any other journey. You're going to expect some bumps here in the road, here or there, and you're going to expect to, kind of potentially have some shifting in your expectations, or in the way that you're viewing the situations. But other than that, I mean, I think, again, just asking as many questions as you possibly can up front before you ever get into an assignment. I think that's the best way you can kind of, not only clarify and start to create that relationship, because it is going to be a relationship that you're
Right.
going to have with the site and with the agency to, essentially kind of be able to help them the best that you can. And so from that standpoint, trying to create that relationship early by communicating and maybe even over communicating, I think is a very valuable way for you to kind of protect yourself and also, just make sure that it's going to be the right situation for you and get you in the best spot.
Perfect. Perfect. All right, Jerry. Well, thank you so much. It's been almost an hour. I'm so glad you joined the call and you shared all your wisdom. So appreciate everything you did today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, Jared. Thank you.